Hello, welcome to Stories in Focus. I'm your storyteller host, Eloise Schottler, and today we have a very special guest, storyteller, writer, and teacher. Solveig Erggez is here with us today, and I've been looking forward to having you, Solveig.
Well, I have just been so excited to come here.
Good. I'm glad we're going to have a fine time. That there's so many things to ask you about. Tell us to begin with so our audience will know, where are you from originally?
Well, I'm from Iceland. I was born in Iceland, and both of my parents were Icelandic. And I even went to school there, to boarding school in Iceland.
But you've spent a lot of time in the Washington area, right?
Yes, I was here. My father was in the Foreign Service, Icelandic, and so we were in England for 5 years and 6 years here, and then we went to Germany. So and then I was born in Iceland before that. So.
Right. Because we're going to talk a little bit, but later. She has a wonderful book that's been out for a few years called Seal Woman, which is set in Iceland. And is that based on mostly childhood memories, or do you go back frequently, or how do you keep that fresh?
It's the part that is set in Iceland is based on my time on a farm in Iceland. So as a teenager, I did go several summers in a row and stayed with relatives on a farm. So, but I have been going every year ever since anyway. So. But the specific scenes derive from those teen years.
Now tell us about your experience when you were doing storytelling in the schools or for children, or how are you doing that?
Well, I always volunteered in the schools, and I sent my son to a school that was near our house, and I wanted to kind of keep up with what was going on there.
Yeah.
And so I volunteered to tell stories in the library. And so I told to the whole school, the whole elementary school, for about 8 years. Saw him through that school pretty much. And
how did he like that?
Oh, he was fine with that.
Cool.
It was because he knew I was seeing all the grades. I wasn't just focusing on him. And I told folk tales and fairy tales. So I didn't know personal stories, but and I really learned a lot about audiences and how children respond and what brings them into a story.
Right. Now, would you call yourself primarily a writer?
Yes. I am primarily a quiet person who sits and writes, and not one who performs.
Right, but you're certainly a storied person. You're certainly a story person. And you had a lot of experience in writing as a journalist?
Yes, I was a journalist. Well, I wrote for Roll Call, the newspaper in Washington, D.C., and then I wrote for 11 years for the Alexandria Port Packet. And I was their first reporter, and then later I just did freelance for newspapers, and so so I was doing I did a lot of nonfiction, and
when you were a reporter, and you're gathering story, how does that work? What are you looking for? How do you get it out of the person? How do you get the material together to write your piece?
Well, you look for the human angle, the story, really, because readers that's what they want. They really just want to know about another human being. And so if something happens to someone, you interview them and ask them for the details. And then you can write about the problem or the larger issue around that person's experience. So, it's very much focused on people.
Okay, because one of the things, I'm just trying to sort out how I want to phrase this question and get at it. You're saying that as a reporter, you talk to the individual, and you're really then also scoping out how that person's experience is going to fit into whatever's going on in the community, so that you'll have a bigger story than just their story?
Well, yeah, usually you would be interviewing a person because of a larger issue. And so you already have that issue and the context, in which to fit it. So I did a lot of covering of civic associations and talking to individuals who were very interested in particular things, like in Old Town Alexandria, the airplane noise and
Yes,
the
yes.
bridge and things like that,
Yeah.
So, that's...
Were you trained as a journalist?
Actually, I was in the journalism school for a while at the University of Kansas, but I ended up doing political science. But I took quite a few courses in the journalism school. It was a sort of a minor that I did there. So, yeah.
As you're talking about it and about your approach to, asking the questions of the person and then fitting the story in, that's wonderful prep for someone who's going to be a novelist, isn't it?
Yes, I think so.
How does it work? How is that prep?
Well, human beings are just so endlessly interesting, and that's what stories are all about. So, the more you understand a person from the inside, the more you are prepared to turn that person into a story.
Yes, to turn that person into a story.
Right.
Okay. Because now, for the audience to know, as Solveig taught a week-long workshop at the Writers Center in Bethesda this summer, and I took that class as a storyteller. I also am very interested in characters, and your purpose for that class was to teach people and demonstrate how you develop characters.
Yes.
How did you go about that, and how do you translate what you taught us into what you do yourself when you're developing your characters?
I try to understand the character. I have a vague idea of what might happen, but I usually start with the kind of person that I am interested in, and then I go and look at the traits of that character and speculate on what she might be thinking and what obstacles she faces, and what is her ambivalence. So she wants this, but she's afraid of that, and that creates a conflict right there. So I just try to look at the character very, very closely, but then there's also the plot, and so that, or the action that happens, and that will impact the character. So I keep revisiting the character and say, well, what do you think of that?
Yeah. How'd that go for you?
Yeah, and now how are you going to respond?
Right.
And I find this is a good way to keep the story developing from inside the character, letting the story grow out of the character, even in the face of external events.
Okay, because that's a different way of describing that writing rather than you're making it up and applying it to the character. You're really talking about that when you work with the character, you're wanting the character's actions to develop the story. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yes, I want it to grow from, I want the character to be central. But this is something I have learned, that it's far more interesting to have the story grow out of the character than to impose the story on the character. And it's funny that I was driving over here, I was listening to an interview with Alice McDermott, and she'd been my sort of my mentor at a Sewanee conference back in 2001. I had then the manuscript with me of the book, which is now called Curve of the Earth, and it was very much about world events. I was in love with the history, and so there was so much going on with the Nazis and the communists and World War II and all this. And Alice looked at me at one point, when we were having our one-to-one discussion, and she said, you cannot have these characters carrying World War II on their shoulders. You just have to let them be. And every time he looks into Clara's eyes, he's not going to be thinking of the whole Stalin regime and everything and the Siberian camps. People just aren't like that. It's too much of a weight on the characters. And so that was hard for me because I had been in newspapers, and I believed in details and historic details, and so I shifted it. And I think I'm still learning how to do that, to make the character central, and the history is like back here.
The background.
Yes.
Yeah, which is something that storytellers, we all work for that. We all work for, this is so helpful because we all work for that. One of the things that you pointed out in your workshop this summer was that when classes I've had where I was being taught about storytelling, everybody starts off by saying, you must have a beginning, middle, and an end. Bump, 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 bump.
Yeah.
But I was so caught by the fact that you started off by saying that you have a character, and then you feed that character some situation, and that what happens is what develops the plot. So that it wasn't setting it up in exactly the same way that I had already heard before.
Yeah.
How did you come to that?
Well, through hard experience, I did read Annie Lamott's Bird by Bird. I was very influenced by that. And but I just gradually came to see how if you know the character really well, then that's a world of its own. And you have an interaction between an event, something that happens, and what's inside the character. That in itself is a story.
All right, but what then that comes to mind is if you have understanding, a reaction with the character, are you talking about yourself? Because you've developed that character. So is the character the writer?
Oh, do you mean if you are, in the case of a memoir or a
No, I'm talking about in the case even of developing a novel or another story. If you are developing the character, actually, is that character you? Because you are building.
No. No, I mean, this is an important mental activity.
Yes.
Is to say, I am over here, my character is here. Now, if I have experienced something in my relationship with my mother or something like that that's quite authentic, I can pile it into that, load it into that character, but I'm still going to be over here, and my character is a work of art. It's
So that's your painting.
Yeah. Oh, yes. And I think it's very important to achieve that distance. But everything you've ever known in life, you can
put into it, but it's not you.
It's not you. And I almost think this is true of memoir, that it's not even
I was just
quite
going
you.
I was going to ask you that question, because where does that feed in?
Yeah.
Where does that work with memoir?
Because with memoir, you are also creating a character, and it's not really you. If you're 33 years old today and you're writing about yourself when you were 6, that is a person that deserves to be seen as a character, because there's a gap between you as the 33-year-old writer or whatever and that child.
Okay.
Even though you are one, and you have the same name.
Yeah, you have the same name, the same
Birthday.
DNA. Yes, yes. I think this is really fascinating, and it's so good for anybody that's interested and wants to be storyteller, or for any storyteller to talk to people who are dealing with creating story. And so thank you. We're going to take a break, and we're coming back with Solveig, and she's going to read a bit from Seal Woman, and then we'll talk about it and get to what she's doing now.
Oh, sweetheart. Gonna give you a hand?
No thanks, Dad. I got it.
Okay. I'm gonna go fix the lamp in your room.
You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. There are thousands of children in foster care who will take you just as you are.
Welcome back to Stories in Focus. And I'm Eloise Schottler, your host, and I'm back here with our special guest, Solveig Erggez, who is a writer and she's going to read to us today from her novel, Seal Woman. Seal Woman was published how long ago?
It was published in 2008.
2008. It's been well awarded and recognized. And when I read it, I was just absolutely struck by the gorgeousness of the language. And I've asked her to pick and to read something for us.
That night, Charlotte waited in the hall outside the bedroom until the swish of skirts stopped. When she heard the bedboards creak, she tiptoed into the room, slipped off her clothes, laid them at the end of the bed, and crept under the stiff sheets. A sliver of moonlight revealed the old woman's stony profile, still but for the lips, vibrating with each breath. A cow lowed in the home field. On the moor, a horse neighed. But sometime in the night, her two worlds collided. She hadn't expected the ghost of Max, full of blame and love, to cross the Atlantic, to follow her up the hillside. His lean body pressed against hers in the narrow bed. He whispered about Monets, blues, and greens, and she felt safe. But he wouldn't stay the night. When he slipped away into the mist, tears slid down her cheeks and into her ears. And do you want
Tell us
put
about
it in the
that.
context?
Yeah, tell us about that.
This is a German woman, Charlotte, who has gone to Iceland in 1949, coming out of the starvation that existed in Germany after World War II. And she is following an advertisement by Icelandic farmers for farm laborers. And so she is an artist, and she had been married to a Jewish artist who has lost his life in the Holocaust. And the memory of him, of this great love, haunts her. She's trying very, very hard to feel the here and now of this very primitive farm where she has been assigned a roommate whom I only call the old woman. She's the mother of the farmer, and I won't give too much away, but I'll tell you she may be her future mother-in-law. And so she's adjusting to the strange sounds of this farm.
It mentions something too. I think the title, Seal Woman, is intriguing. And what is that? What does that relate to?
The Seal Woman refers to a legend, the legend that many of us know as the Selkie legend. And this is a legend that exists in cold countries that are islands or where there's cold water splashing up on the rocks, and there's poor visibility where the water meets the air of the land. So you fog, mist, darkness, and you have to have seals also. So this story exists in Iceland, Scotland, Shetland and Orkney Islands, Faroe Islands, and Ireland. It's in some form or another. And at the heart of the story is a lonely farmer who mistakes a seal for a woman. Mm-hmm. And he falls in love. And they live happily ever after for a while until she hears the call of her other life, her other world, her seal world.
So you took that thread from the story of the Seal Woman, of a woman who's trapped between two lives, two worlds, two lives, and that feeds the way the story develops and the way she develops.
Yes, it's a story. So many of us are seal women, or seal men maybe. It's a story of a divided consciousness. Someone who's trying very hard to be here and now and just to rake the hay and milk the cows. But the mind is such a powerful and rich thing that it carries the whole past. And it keeps coming up. And that's why Max comes to her. And so I loved this story. I told this story to the children at the school. But I also encountered another story, and that was of Svetlana Stalin. And I remember when she wrote her biography, and her story, she had been cut off from the Soviet Union by her father, the dictator Joseph Stalin, and she had to leave her children behind. She comes to this country and marries an architect and goes to live in Arizona and has a little girl named Olga. What could be better? This is paradise on earth, going to live in Arizona. But she was not happy. She was a SEAL woman. She had those her past in her consciousness. The marriage failed, and she moved to Princeton, I think because it was closer to Europe. But and the weather was less than perfect there. Compare it to Arizona, but she was happier there. Anyway, that story moved me greatly as a SEAL woman, someone who has two worlds to deal with.
Do you think that you must have encountered Svetlana Stalin's story long before you wrote this? Or did you? When did you encounter
I now I don't know the sequence. I just know that was, yes, must have been long, not terribly long before, but it's just at some point while this
so
was
it
all...
just connected.
Yeah, it just went into this story also. It was just a realization that there are real people who are like this.
Well, that sort of says something. I'm just going to throw out this thought that I had, totally unrelated. But, you know, there's a little quandary in the storytelling world these days about the value of folktale.
Yes.
And so what you're saying is that if you have a knowledge of folktale, and if you realize that there is something related to the human experience, which you certainly did, you saw that SEAL woman existence exist in Svetlana Stalin and in your character.
Oh, yes, and
so,
that kind of character.
Yeah, if people were open to that, then there might be a welcoming back for the folktale.
Well, not all, of course. The SEAL woman story is a particularly moving story because it's considered a romantic tragedy, and it flourishes in places these places where you have loneliness and poor visibility, so and people fall in love with a
SEAL.
Let's face it. Yeah. So. I won't say this is true of all folk tales, but there are some folk tales that are just unbelievably moving. Very just, you just know, oh, it's me. I have told folk tales actually not just in schools, but fairly recently I was doing this at women's shelters, and the response there was sometimes, you know, people would suddenly just start talking and say, I didn't mean to be so mean to her. You know, I'm thinking of a different story, a kind of a Cinderella kind of story that brought a tremendous response. SEAL Woman's story brought a tremendous response in the shelter.
Oh, I just can't imagine that.
Not my story, but the legend, because in the legend, the woman goes back to her children in the ocean. She's called by them, and she goes back to them. And one of the women in the shelter said, she did the right thing.
By going back.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, now, one of the things I don't want all the time to slip by without asking you about the story you're working on now.
Well, I have finished that story, but it's not published yet, and it's called Curve of the Earth, and that's a story I mentioned earlier about World War II, and Iceland's involvement in World War II. That is the setting. It's really about a woman who struggles and she's angry, but the setting is and the place is Iceland, World War II. So I'm giving a talk on that October 1 in Old Town Alexandria. But my talk is not about the book. It's about the research that went into the book.
Right. Okay. Where could people find out about that? That's October the 1st if they wanted to come. Is it connected with the Torpedo Factory?
It's the Torpedo Factory a lecture series. And they have a monthly lecture at the Morrison House in Old Town.
Now, tell me, what in the research process. What do you want to tell people about your process of the research of World War II in Iceland?
Well, it just, I was just incredulous to read the deep involvement, in fact, of the U.S. in World War II in Iceland. I mean, they had destroyers in the biggest fjord there, the Hvalfjord. That's where they anchored the destroyers. And this was in July 1941, many months before Pearl Harbor. And these destroyers were going out and escorting the convoys to Britain, the lifeline, providing the lifeline to Britain. And Hitler was very determined not to hit any of these U.S. boats because that would bring the U.S. in. But Roosevelt kept sending those boats out, and Hitler, one of Hitler's torpedoes finally did hit one, and that was in October 1941. That was, by that time, you know, there was a huge occupation force in Iceland, U.S. occupation force. Deep involvement. I was fascinated by that.
History, isn't it?
It's little known history, and the other part that fascinated me at the same time as this is that there was a handful of Jewish refugees fleeing Hitler that settled in Iceland. They came through Denmark because Denmark took no foreign Jews in, but Iceland had been a colony of Denmark, and so several of them found their way there. One of those people is in my story.
Oh, all
He's the love
right.
interest.
Okay, all right. So you really then, had you known this history prior to your research as a child or in the schools or anything? Did you get any of it?
Well, Eloise, to tell you the truth, I really thought that I was always reading these Icelandic authors about the history of Iceland, World War II, and then this Jewish angle. I was just fascinated by it, and I planned to write a nonfiction book about it. But I realized that what I was doing then was just translating. This has been so well researched by Icelandic historians that I didn't think that was right for me just to translate.
Well, in a novel, you could make more of your own comment, couldn't you?
Yeah, and then much
now
more.
You found out.
Well, and then you have the problem of all those internal problems and the love issues and anger and all that you don't have with just dealing with history. So
wow.
that was I had to really turn that around.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Well, and right now, a story that's about World War II is rather interesting to think about because I haven't seen a news story about anything about World War II in a long time.
Yeah, that is the background for it. But she had the character. She's just trying to make her way through. She's the occupation, protecting her daughter from the soldiers, things like little problems like that.
Things like, well, now I'm sure that you're as curious as I am, and I will want to know about the story of that as Solveig emerges with that. And so, Solveig, thank you so much for coming. I
my
really
pleasure.
enjoyed it. Now, we need your website, www.
It's solveigerggez.com.
Okay.
If you can spell my name right. Now, I know that's a challenge, but...
Yeah, well, we'll have it on the bottom of the screen, I'm sure. So thank you very much. Thank you for coming. And we'll be back with another guest shortly.